But we're all here. We all made it
We
down.
made it.
So thank you all for being here. It's great to see you all. We're delighted that you could join us, as Oprah says. Anyway, so I just want to say a little bit about, this is welcome to the first of Talk of the Town. I'm Foster Hirsch. This is Victoria Wilson. I'm glad you're all paying attention. And so the way this came about is about 6 months ago, I was in conversation with Foster about his fabulous book, Hollywood and Movies of the 50s, which we just published. And we had such a good time, we decided, well, let's have a series of conversations. So we put our heads together and our pencils and other things. And so what we decided, and the way it sort of evolved, is that there is going to be one talk a month. And the first one is just entre nous. And then the next is with Rose Styron, the fabulous Rose Styron, whose memoir I published, and she's 96 and going strong. And then Nicholas Fox Weber, who's spent 15 years writing a book on Mondrian, who is the head of the Albers Foundation, and he's quite splendiferous, and the book is his best book yet, and it's an extraordinary book. And then in December, we have our special guest, Julie Gilbert, who's written a fabulous book on the writing of Giant and the making of the movie. And it's great fun, and I have a lot to say, regardless of what she has to say. I have a lot to say on Edna Ferber and why she isn't read anymore and how she holds up and what she went through. But okay, as they said, that's for another time. So tonight it's just, Foster and I are in conversation, but the overall series ended up being about writers and writing and large lives lived, whether books or memoir or biography. And so tonight Foster and I are going to talk about writing and editing and writing. And so there we are. So welcome to Talk of the Town.
And do we want to mention our podcast?
Over to you.
Okay. Vicki and I started a podcast, the Victoria Wilson Foster Hirsch podcast. It's pretty direct on the art of the arts, about books and movies and other things. And we went live yesterday. And it's up. Our first conversation is up on YouTube, Spotify, www.
And our website. Which is the Victoria Wilson Foster Hirsch podcast. And there it is under episodes. And everybody's welcome, and come join us.
Yes, and we're talking about my book.
And listen to us argue. But no, Foster likes everything, and I am Miss Grump and don't like much. So
makes for a very good combination.
Right, exactly. We live happily ever after, and we've worked together. I like to tell this story. When I first started on writing this biography of Barbara Stanwyck 10,000 years ago, Volume 1. I thought, okay, well, let me look up about film noir, and I got this book. And I started reading this book by Foster Hirsch, and I thought, this is an absolutely fabulous book. I have to find this man, and because maybe I'd want to publish him. So I said to my assistant, it's like Clark Gable, get him on the phone. And 2 seconds later, he came in, and here was the number. I said, how did you find it so fast? He said, I looked it up in the phone book. And it's a nice Jewish girl. Who would think of looking something up in the phone book? Anyway, but there were phone books in those days, and we got them every year, and we hated having them, but they served us well. And anyway, that's how I found Foster.
But just let me tell you how Vicki operates. She called me, and I had the sense to know that this was the most important professional phone call of my life. I just knew it. and she said, I really love your book. And she said, what are you working on now? And I said, I'm about ready to sign tomorrow for a book on Kurt Weill. And Vicki said, don't sign. And within 2 days, she had a contract for me from Knopf.
There's no way that happened like that. I know it felt like that. But I know Knopf, and I know how things worked, and it sure didn't work that fast. But you know what? It worked out. It was a happy ending, and we've been living together happily ever since.
It worked very fast, though. You were quick. But you said, don't sign.
Well, that was true, and that was the correct.
And I was signing the next morning. Anyway, a happy story. But I think it's great to be here with Vicki, who was, for 51 years, an editor at America's finest publisher, Alfred Knopf. You don't have a job like that at the top of the publishing industry without knowing what you're doing. So my question is to you, what qualities does a good editor have to have?
Well, you know, the easy answer is to say you have to be a good reader. But what that means is there's really so much more that's involved in that simple sentence, because you really have to trust your instincts, and you have to not really care what anybody else thinks. Because the job of publishing, and what it used to be, it's what it is now, that's another conversation. But what the job of publishing was for so many, many years, and for many people still, is to discover writers and to bring into the world those sensibilities, those talented people, those pieces of writing that you admire, that you think are new, that do something to you, that, you know, make you breathe more heavily because you've discovered somebody who was fabulous. I mean, for instance, we started a book club, and I'd never read Edna O'Brien. And we decided that we alternate one new and one old. So we finished reading Anne Bronte, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I could have an entire course on that book, because nobody reads it, and I think it's the best of the Brontes. But anyway, and so I started reading Edna O'Brien, this great Irish writer, who alas is no longer with us, and within 2 pages my breath was taken away, because it was so potent, it was so powerful, it just, you know, the writing was so beautiful. It was, and it wasn't just beautiful, it was so particular, and it so captured on so many different levels, so much life, so much feeling, so much ambivalence, so much trappedness. I mean, I could go on, but the point is, when you find something like that, you know, and you don't find writers like that a lot, but it's really about being a good reader, and then...
And being excited about good writing.
Well, it's about being open. It's about being open to to everything. And, you know, I'm interested, my list was extremely broad, and, you know, I would publish, you know, kind of fiction like Laurie Moore, who I discovered, and then I might publish, you know, a book on The Lost Mary, which I am publishing next year, on Jesus's mother. And, you know, it's really, if you have a lot of interest, but then you have to turn around and sell it to the house, and that's where you have to really be, and it has become harder and harder and harder, and you have to be willing to fight. And when the worst thing that anybody could ever say to me, which is what most people respond to, is, well, I showed it to, let's say, we showed it to 5 people and they all felt this way. And my answer is, I don't care. I do. You know, I don't care. This is what I believe, this is what I think. And so you know, it's about, you know, setting out on your own.
Do you have to be open to a lot of different subjects you don't know about?
Well, you have to be interested. I mean, I've had, in 51 years, I've had the most extraordinary education. But it's really about being interested. And there's something, whether you're getting a proposal or you're reading pages, and a lot of times, I would get a proposal and there would be something there. The proposal would be totally rough, a mess. And in the end, I knew when I read the proposal that the book was going to be something completely different, but it didn't matter because there was something there. And, there was most recently where these proposals became so important. And I would say, it doesn't matter what's in the proposal. It's just what you feel, what you sense that talent or whatever. It doesn't matter what's there because it's going to be something completely different.
But you can tell from a proposal the quality of the book that will emerge.
Well, you take a chance. I mean, I could, but it doesn't. Sometimes you're surprised, and sometimes you say, "Oh, Jesus, why did I buy this book?" And it didn't turn out the way you thought it was going to. I mean, that happens too. But more often than not, it's a great process to watch, which is why we can discuss this later. Which is why it was so interesting when I set out on that course myself.
But that's a different sensibility, being an editor and a writer. But I want to share with our friends here something you told me as an editor that had an enormous influence, because as a writer, you have to listen to your editor, and there's an art to listening. I hear you. I know how to listen. So a Vicky sentence, I can go to town with one sentence. I know what she's saying. So before I started writing my huge book on Hollywood in the 50s, Vicky said this sentence, which was in my mind every day that I was working on the book. She said, "You cannot go from film to film. It will drive the reader crazy." I heard that. And what I did was I situated the film in social and political and cultural context and did not go from film to film. But that one sentence was my guide through the book. You might have said the sentence just casually, but I heard it as crucial in structuring the book.
And you wrote a great book.
Well, with your help in the structure. with your help in the structure. I turned in the first draft, and when a writer turns in his or her book, you're entrusting your life to another person. Do you ever think of yourself as having with writers a doctor-patient relationship?
No, it's much more interesting than that. But I understand, first of all, my father was a writer, and I thought I understood what that experience was like, and so I was very sensitive to it. But it's not until you actually have that experience yourself that you understand what it means. But I understand that somebody's ripped their skin off to write this book, that whatever it is, and that, you try and read it as quickly as possible and don't keep the writer waiting. And then you have to be honest. I mean, the point is that an editor is there basically to be the person and to tell you what all of your friends are not going to tell you. Right. And, you ask the question when we sort of swapped questions. And if you want to ask it, you can ask it. Otherwise, I'll just work it in, which is, if somebody doesn't want to.
Well, yeah, that is a wonderful question. When Vicky said something to me about structure, your first instinct humanly is to resist criticism, But then you have to take a deep breath and acknowledge that the editor is more objective than you are. And the editor might be telling you what you don't want to hear, but it's better for the book. So I would always take a deep breath. And you have a phrase that you use. It strikes terror in one's heart when you hear it. You need to do some rethinking. No writer wants to hear that sentence. You need to do some rethinking. But once you get over that, then you have to be able to hear what that rethinking consists of. With Otto Preminger, you said to me, you don't stay close enough to him. In my first draft, I kept going off and at tangents. She said, you have to stay close to him on every page, and that guided me through the rewriting. So are there writers where you've said things like that, and they say to you, I just don't see the book the way you do?
Well, if somebody doesn't see if somebody doesn't see the whole book the way, they don't have to see it the way I do. It just has to work. And, what I would say is, there are many people who have said, well, I just don't see that I just don't see this. Or when I'd say, this character is doing this, it's not plausible, it's not believable, I just don't get it, it doesn't work, or for whatever reason. And if the answer is, well, I don't agree with you, and I want to continue to publish the book, my answer to them, which is the great line that Helen Wilson, my mother, used to say when we'd go shopping, and I would try on something terrible, obviously, and she would say, well, darling, you have to wear it, you have to like it. And of course, in which case I'd throw it off. And buy whatever it was that she wanted me to buy. But the point is that what my answer really to a writer is, look, this is your book. You're going to have to live with it. I'm going to be long out of your life, and you're going to have to live with this book. So go with God. And then you're getting the reviews. I'm saying it more gently than that, but it is their book, and and that's their prerogative.
But you allow for that?
Absolutely.
You do.
Don't do it. But it doesn't matter now because I'm not Knopf. But I will be. Who knows how things will work out? But anyway, yes. You don't have to do. And here's another thing. What an editor needs to do is to be able to express what is the problem. If you can't communicate what the issue is, and you're unable to articulate it, then you're of no use. You can't just say, well, it's too long or it's too this. There are some books where I've said it's too long and go away and cut 15%. In fact, I did that with my own book. I went away and cut more than 15%, and it was, I don't want to say it was still too long, but it probably was. And anyway, so it's it's their book.
Do you have any stories you can tell us about stubborn authors?
Well, I can tell you, since she's no longer living, that I discovered a writer called Anne Rice, and I edited the first book, Interview with a Vampire. I did a lot of work, and she did a lot of work. We did a lot of work together. And then I turned down the next book, and she went to Simon & Schuster. And then her third book, Cry to Heaven, which was about castrati that in no way Simon & Schuster got. And I said, oh, this is fabulous, come back. And I edited that book, but it was very painful for her. It was just painful. So at a certain point, there came a time where she said, I'm not doing any, I can't have my books edited. And I thought about it, and we thought about it as the house, and we decided, do we want to proceed? And, I would at a certain point, I would say certain things that she would listen to, but it was a different kind of editing. And look, the books were still successful, but they didn't have the precision that they had had before, which is not to say because of what I did, it was because of what she was willing to do to further, work on the book. It's a process. And it's a process that goes on forever, for a long time.
Did you make adjustments to your sense of the personality of the writer? This writer can accept this much and in this tone? Were you?
Of course.
Did you?
Well, there'd be something wrong with me if it was just, I'd be like Miss AI if I just said, okay, do it this way. Of course, you're responding to a human being and you have a relationship with that person. And some people, one person is one way and one person is another way. And, you just have to, you're just responding to a human being.
So there are gradations in what you say to different authors.
Yeah, I would hope, yes. Absolutely, without question.
Victoria, were you ever wrong?
So many.
I mean that seriously. Were you ever, where you said, oh, well, maybe I was wrong about this, that this should have been the way it...
Well, that's interesting that you would ask that question because I'm just editing a book now. And it's a very long description of what the book was, not what it was about, but what its problems were. And I cut a lot of it. And it's the hardest kind of cutting because it was line by line. It was a very long book. It was like 600 or 700 pages. And I cut it. It took me, 50 pages a day. And he just sent in the revision. And I was thinking, I may have cut too much of this. I may have taken out too much of the blood. And I'm only, I'm just a third of the way in, so I don't know. Was I wrong? I've been wrong about many, many things. So yes, the answer is I've been wrong many times. But not really in terms of, I don't think I've been wrong in terms of, for the most part, in terms of the way I've edited books. I've been wrong in a lot of books that I haven't published. I wasn't wrong in that they weren't for me, but they went on to make a lot of money. For instance, Anne Rice sent in this manuscript at a certain point under this name A.N. Roquelaure, and it was S&M porn, and I just couldn't bear it. It was just like I was allergic to it. And I said, look, I can't stand this kind of writing. Don't take it personally, but I just hate the form. And I sent her, she said, well, what do I do with it? So I sent her to this editor, Bill Whitehead, who was at Dutton, who published all of her A.N. Roquelaure books and made millions and millions of dollars. And it wasn't that it was wrong. It wasn't that it was a mistake. It would have been nice if Knopf had made those millions of dollars. But it wasn't a book that kind of writing that I think we would have published and that we would have been right for. So, and that's happened to me many, 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 many times.
I see the job of an editor as rescuing the writer from his or her own work.
Well, you're rescuing, you're helping the writer to write the book that he or she is trying to write. And there are certain blind spots, there are certain things that you can't see, which is why, for instance, when Kathy Harrigan is here, and she's lived through this for years with me, when I would write copy, I would go over it and over it. The drafts would be like this thick for a piece of flaps copy, but it had to be absolutely right. And so you put it aside, and then you go back to it the next day, and you see 10 things that you didn't see before. And you magnify that 1,000 times on a manuscript.
The writer, I can say for myself, when you start a book, you have to feel that you know more about that subject than anybody in the world. Or else what keeps you at your desk? Well,
that's sort of an interesting thing, because when I wrote my proposal for the bar, and I started to write this proposal, it was a long time ago. The internet didn't even exist when I started this. And when I started the proposal, I thought, I'll do this. And read 10,000 proposals. This will be nothing. Yeah, we'll think again. And part of it was that the tone, the voice, and the assurance had to be as if I knew everything about Barbara Stanwyck when I knew nothing about Barbara Stanwyck. And so that's what I was going to ask you, which is, for instance, how did you start? What gave you permission to write your first book? How did you come to your first book?
It's amazing. When you're young, you don't think you need to know everything in order to write. When you mature, you can't write until you think you know everything. So when I started out, I thought, oh, I'm a good writer. I know this subject. It's fine. I gave myself permission to start without being an expert.
Well, what was your first book? How did you come to write that first book?
Well, the first book was just a monograph, I'm almost ashamed to say. There was a series called The Pyramid Illustrated History of the Movies. Jim, do you remember that?
Yes, oh yeah.
You remember that? And I got to know the editor, and he said, well, we're looking for actors. Who do you want to write about? So I said, well, I'm crazy about Elizabeth Taylor. So I wrote a monograph on Elizabeth Taylor. Did I know a lot about her? I'd seen all her movies. I was a fan.
Had you written anything before?
I'd written reviews.
And did you one day say, I think I want to write a book?
I always knew I wanted to write.
But a book?
A book, always.
Okay.
Always.
Okay, so how did you approach, what book do you think is a book that you would be proud to talk about right now?
Well, the 50s, that's the one I'm proudest of.
Okay.
And as I was writing it, and after I published it, and I'm going to say it here in public, I do feel I know more about Hollywood in the 50s than any other living human being. I really do feel that way. I do. I've seen more movies. I saw them when they came out. I can tell you the theaters I saw them in, where I sat in the theaters, and who I saw the movies with. I can tell I know more than anybody about first-run movies in Los Angeles in the 50s. I can tell you what theater those films opened at.
Okay, so the question is, you've been really thinking about this book for decades, but not knowing it.
Not knowing it. How long did it take you to write your book on the 50s? About 70 years.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's a book you've been thinking about for
my whole life.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Okay, so talk about how you went about, it's a huge subject, and talk about not what you arrived at, but the process of how you arrived at how you were going to approach it.
You see tons of films, you take notes on the films, but because of what you said, don't go from film to film, I started reading everything about the 50s. Korean War and the Red Menace and the House on Un-American Activities Committee, the presidents. I became an expert on Eisenhower. I read everything about the period. I became totally absorbed in the period. Now that I didn't know in a specialist way. And I also discovered films that I didn't know. But it was always about me and the films. I never wrote as a disinterested historian. And you made the point, and I think it's true, my book has a strong authorial voice. I'm writing that book. If nobody else would have been able to write the book or would write it in the tone that I had. I have a distinct authorial voice.
Okay, well, this is a personal book. It has, it's your childhood.
Yeah.
It's your coming of age. So that's really what, if a lot of times when you read a book and you're about to describe it, I wouldn't have said that in the copy, but that's really what this book is. But, okay, so, you've written a book about Otto Preminger. You've written about Kurt Weill. And so talk about the difference in the processes of writing about each of these.
Well, that's interesting, those two, because Otto Preminger I was drawn to because I always liked his films. But I didn't know why exactly, and then when I was doing the book, I realized he does long takes, and no close-ups and avoids editing, but has majestic camera movement. That's the kind of movie making I like. Christopher Nolan drives me crazy because it's nothing but close-up, 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 cut, cut, cut. Camera movement gets me dizzy. I couldn't stand Oppenheimer. So Otto was the exact opposite. And I realized I like him, and I was always drawn to him as a kid because that's my sensibility for filmmaking. Kurt Weill was totally different. They came to me. I didn't choose the subject. The head of the Kurt Weill Foundation said, I love your book on Hal Prince and Stephen Sondheim. We need a book on Kurt Weill for the centennial celebrations. Would you do it? It's usually not a good idea to choose a subject, to have a subject chosen for you. I didn't know anything about Kurt Weill. And that was not a labor of passion like my 50s book. But it came out okay. I did a decent job.
Good. No, it was good.
It's a good book. But the 50s book is my very essence.
So if you had to describe sort of the problems that you had with each book and how you solved each of those major problems.
You helped me in each case.
Here's your $5.
Yeah. I probably don't. I'd be interested in hearing this, but I probably work very differently from other writers who work with Vicki. But I don't show my work to anyone. I write, and I'm writing for Vicki. She's my first reader. I'm writing for her. And so I'm writing, what will Vicki say about this sentence, about this? And I trust her to be the first reader. Other writers have many readers and advisors. I say too many cooks spoil the broth. And I do not turn in chapters. I turn in when I'm done. That's more efficient for me. But for Kurt Weill, your response was, the book is slow moving. I went back and boy, did the pace pick up, and it made a difference. For Otto Preminger, you say you have to stay close to him. And then for the 50s, we discussed. So that, you always gave me a through line.
When was the Otto Preminger?
2007.
Okay, now it's interesting that I would say that because I don't know that many editors would have been able to say that to you, but the reason why I was able to say that to you is because I knew firsthand what that fear was of your subject. Because I knew that from my writing of the Stanwyck. And I could tell that it took me a while because I was too frightened. And then when something, I interviewed a source and something unlocked and she became human. And then I could get close to her. But, and I can see that. I can see that. I mean, there's a book that I
wasn't close enough to Otto on the first round.
Right. Because there was something they were a little nervous about getting that close to.
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't close enough to him. And then I stopped being so polite, and I could get closer.
So what did you learn from writing each book?
Writing never gets any easier. I have to tell you, it gets harder and harder. And I expect more of myself than I did. When you're young, you just write and you don't have to know everything. But when you're older, you know more, and the more you know, the more intimidating it is to write. Mm-hmm. And writing, absolutely writing doesn't get any easier. And the second sentence needs to be, and it shouldn't.
No, exactly. I mean, it is this process that I see it as surrendering. It's just like going under. And you're going under and deeper and deeper and deeper, and then you come up, and then you go under again. It is that. To me, it has that kind of physicality to it.
But you were an editor for many years, then you became a biographer. Do you sit at the writing desk the same way you sit reading an author's manuscript?
Physically, do I sit at?
No, I mean mentally.
Let's get the two completely. I mean, the way, editing for me is like getting into a warm bath. And writing is like, a petite who's up on the World Trade Center and you're crossing that wire. And one is terrifying, and where you're an editor, you're a fully in control, self-possessed human being. And then when you're a writer, and there's a tiny hairs difference, you turn into this completely needy, pathetic person who is full of fear and who has to constantly go through the fear. And it's interesting when you said you're writing for Vicky, because I'm writing for Vicky. Because when I read I hadn't read, it's a whole long story about what happened with volume 1, but it wasn't supposed to be 2 volumes. But anyway, it ended up as that. So I had to go back, and I'd never read the book from beginning to how I was going to decide how to end it or where to stop it. And I started reading it, and I said, these pages are totally not ready for Vicky, the editor, to read. This is a disgusting mess, and I have to go back and rewrite this. And I did, and over and over and over, and piecing it all together, and taking it apart and piecing it together. And eventually it was ready for Vicky, the editor, to read it. And it's completely different. They're 2 different functions. One is going out and one is going in, which is why when I was at Knopf, I always said I have the perfect job, because I was going out and working on books that were being published, or that were about to be published, or they were going to be published in a year or 2 years or 3 years. And then at night I would go home and go back to 1928. So it was a perfectly balanced life.
Did you actually have an outside editor when you were writing this down?
Yes, I did. And I had a wonderful editor named Michael Korda, who I adored. But Michael started to cut the book when he had just read it the first time. And you can't cut a book like that unless you know it intimately, because you don't know what the writer's leading up to or what they're setting up or whatever. And so the person who I really trusted is sitting in this audience, Catherine Horrigan, who, among other things, is Robert Caro's editor. And Kathy was for many, many years the exalted managing editor at Alfred A. Knopf, otherwise what I call Alfred A. Gesundheit. And I trusted Kathy. Kathy had been reading sections. I totally trusted her. And Michael wrote a whole long letter saying, cut this, cut this, cut this. And I knew that it wasn't right. But as Foster said, somebody's trying to help me. I want it to be open. It's, there's the slogan, listen and learn. And so I said to Kathy, read the letter. Whatever you tell me is appropriate and right, I will follow. And I did. Is that not the case? And
but when you wrote, and you're writing now, do you write with your editorial brain functioning, or do you write with the writer's brain?
I write with both voices, because are you trying to tell me something? Oh, no, okay. The writer's voice is, this is how I want to do it, and the editor's voice is, you're really going to have to cut a lot of this. And the writer says, well, this is the way I have to do it, so I'm just going to do it. And the editor says, okay, well, we'll deal with it later. And that's how I don't torture myself. But I definitely have both voices, but I have to put the editor's voice aside and trust my instinct.
But you told me with the auto book to stay close to him. But your book has a different format. It works for your book, where you don't stay close to Stanwyck all the time. You place her in the context of her times. That didn't work for me, for the auto book.
No.
But it does work for your book.
Because in the end, I was writing, even though I didn't know this, I was writing a book about my parents' America. That's what that book ended up being for me. And it was interesting because Stanwyck was a very conservative, it was a different kind of, she was a Republican, a different kind of Republican. It was, an early or late 19th century, early 20th century Republicanism, which is very different. But still, she was against unions, she hated Roosevelt, things like that. And that was great because then I could write about those things. And my parents were, of course, loved, my mother wept when Roosevelt died. So it ended up, and I'm still, on this next book that I'm in, I don't want to talk about different issues that I have, but it's not my parents' America, but it's a moment in my parents' life that happened to her that I'm writing to that is going to be very emotional.
But your structure works, but you don't stay close to her at all times.
But I'm close to her in my head. And everything I'm writing about is in relation to her. She's always there. And anyway, so, Julian, are we?
We're moving towards that. If you're open to doing Q&A, we do some people.
Okay. So,
some questions.
yeah, so who has some questions? Or who has a question? Yes.
Well, I'm reading your book. On the way to Europe and back, and I'm still not finished, but I love it. I feel like you were a fly on the wall with her. And I argued, how much research went into this book? It's so detailed, I think.
It is, and I'm still doing. And when I started it, there was no internet. And then when there was, nothing was digitized. So you become like a fiend, and you have to have the detail that you have to have. But the way these things work, which too, is that you can say, okay, I've got to have that detail, but it's not coming. And then 6 months later, it will come in some other way, and you'll say, oh, that's what I was looking for. So you have to it's an act of trust. It just is. It sounds crazy to say, but don't you think it is?
It is.
Or was it through a newspaper, or what was research? Because I felt there were things that you told that she would, if she wrote a biography, she would have written.
She wouldn't have written this at all.
Exactly. But there were so many details, and I said, I felt like you really knew her.
The people who were closest to her, as Foster said, he knows more about the 50s. I know more about Barbara Stanwyck than anybody. And R.J. Wagner, who was madly in love with her and had a long affair with her, said that I really captured her. And he said, and I didn't set out to do this, he said, and you captured her loneliness. But I felt it.
Her loneliness?
Her loneliness, yeah.
Comes across in the book. There was.
Any other questions? Yeah.
When you talk about editing, you seem to speak about editing down. Something is long, you cut this. If something is presented to you that isn't terribly long, what do you look for in the capacity of being an editor to make it better or sharper if you're not pulling out excess?
Yeah, that's just it's just an easy example of what an editor does, which is why I said that. But you're looking for the truth of the book within itself. That's what you're looking for. So that if something is just standing out that doesn't make sense, or the pacing is off, or, I'm just publishing this collection of essays, and, I might have said, well, what about writing about this? Or what about looking at it this way? For instance, I published this book on women who commit violence. I published it last year. And when Dobbs was overturned, I said, I said to this woman, as an example of many things that I had said to her, I said, you have to write something about this because this is going to cause a lot of women to commit violence because they're going to end up having children that they don't want, that they're not ready to deal with, and they don't want to deal with, and they're going to commit horrible acts of violence, which of course is already happening. But so that's kind of example of the kind of comment I would make.
What do you look for in a proposal?
Just something, well, I mean, you want something that's interesting, that's exciting, that makes you curious, that you say, oh, that's really interesting, or I want to know more about that, and also something that's going to sell. I mean, you know, I have published many, many, many books that didn't sell, but they were important books, and Knopf, and that was Knopf. You know, we published many books that didn't sell, and then there were the books that did sell. And the books that did sell would carry the books that sold, that didn't sell. And they were important to be published for other reasons, for cultural reasons. Is that not true, Kathy?
But you were never driven by commercial considerations above all.
Well, I mean, I don't want to say I'm as pure as rain. I would say that I'm sure there have been times when I said, oh, this is going to sell a lot of copies. But, I mean, I don't want to mention the person's name. But I did get this proposal. It was more than a proposal, of a series. It was going to be a trilogy. And the woman had sold millions of copies. But the material was interesting. It was a really good story, and there was that solidity to it. And in the end, we didn't do it because it just didn't seem right for Knopf to publish this person. But I thought, well, maybe we needed that book. We needed that book. So yes, I mean, you do think about that. It's a business. It's a business. And, I was fortunate, and a lot of books I published did make money. Not all of them made the kind of money that Anne Rice made, because how many books make that kind of money? But
with the exception of Foster, which I know this was surely happened, but can you speak of an experience with an author where all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, this person is truly brilliant, and I can't believe this is happening right now on the page. This is going to be a fantastic journey.
well, I mean, the first one that comes to mind was the first one, which was Anne Rice.
Yeah.
When I saw that, and I said, and I was 22 or 23, and I just said, oh my God, I don't know where this person came from, but this is just upright. This is of the moment. I mean, it's happened to me a number of times. Can you think of some other book where I've had that experience? I mean, it has happened. You know, when I like Laurie Moore or
Foster Hirsch.
Well, we already established that.
Foster Hirsch was in addition. But it's mostly, that kind of thing happens with, I mean, I'm trying to think of a book a nonfiction book where I said, oh my God, this is totally important. I'll tell you, yes, I can. I published a book. I got a proposal that came in by a woman called Suzanne Simard, on how, this was the forest ecologist who proved that trees do communicate with one another. And it was a fabulous proposal. And when I spoke to her on the phone, I remember saying, usually I'll say on the phone, well, I like the proposal, but I think that if we work together, I'm going to really push you in this direction or that direction. And I said, I really have nothing to say about where this book has to go, because this is a brilliant proposal. And I went back to people who control the money, et cetera, and to Sunny. And I said, just be prepared, because we are going to publish this book, and I don't care how much it costs, we are going to get this book. And that's exactly what happened, because we didn't even talk about this, but there comes a moment when you're in an auction where you choke. And you say, everybody chokes, and they say, well, I don't think we should go any further. And I had it was a great learning experience for me when I went through that fear, because I forget what the book was. It might have been Hillary Clinton. I can't remember. But there were a number of them where we choked, or I choked, and I didn't push. And after that, and I went through that fear, and I said, I'm not doing that again. And I pushed myself, and we ended up buying that book. And it was a great book to publish. And an important book. And you know what? Foreign publishers for 6 months came in and would go see all these other publishers, and then they'd come to my office and they'd say, these other publishers are still talking about that book that you got. Because it was not a good book not to publish. It was great that we published it. Anyway, that's an example. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all, and thank you, Foster.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time with Rose Styron.
October 30th is a Wednesday night, and indeed we will be back with Rose Styron. So please mark your calendars and join us downstairs for dinner, drinks. We'll see you down there.
Great, thank you.